In this video, I'm testing Retell and Voiceflow in 7 areas from ease of use and telephony options to latency, pricing, and hidden costs to see which is the better platform for building voice AI agents. I'll also link to a side-by-side comparison below with all the results, and you can plug in your requirements to see which tool's the better fit for you. So let's start with Retell AI. So Retell AI is one of the easiest platforms to build voice agents on, particularly if you're a beginner. So from their platform, you can create an agent up here, go to voice agent, and you got a few options. Now, the templates are very good in Retell. Generally, I recommend starting with a conversational flow agent. This means you can build your voice agent out on a nice visual canvas. This also has some benefits from a latency perspective because it means rather than sticking one gigantic prompt that is being sent with every call to the LLM, you can break your prompt out into different steps, giving your voice agent only the context that it needs at each step of the conversation. So I'll just show you kind of how that looks. If we go into conversational flow agent, we'll create that. And I'll talk through a couple of kind of key features and concepts in Retell as we go. So here you can see the main visual canvas that you build out your voice agents on, and you can enter your prompts into any of these nodes. Then you got your different node options down the left here. So you can add a call transfer node. We can add functions, which I'll touch on in a second. Conversation nodes, SMS, extracting variables, MCP connections. Again, I'll touch on in a moment. You enter in the prompt or a static sentence, and then you can set up your transition. Then you can set up your transition. Then you can enter here. Then you enter in your transitions, which is just the kind of the possible outcome, the possible things the caller could say at that step. And then you just connect them to the different nodes. Then if you click into any node, you've got all the options for how to configure that node. So if we go into this one, for example, we'll see you could change the LLM it uses, for example. We can add knowledge to it. We can make it a global node, which means that the agent can decide to jump to that node at any point in the conversation. Just on that point, there's 2 different nodes for building. In Retell, you can either have rigid mode where it follows the flow quite precisely. This is pretty good if you have a very predictable conversational flow and you essentially want it to follow a script. Or you've got flex mode, which allows for a little bit of variability and means that if we're going down this path, but someone suddenly mentions something that has a path over here, it gives the agent the autonomy to jump between different nodes. So as you can see, it's visually very intuitive. So let's touch on telephony and voice options. So the default voice engine that Retell uses is ElevenLabs, which is the one that I would generally recommend. You do have a few other options like Cartesia, Minimax, OpenAI Voices, but generally speaking, for most agents, you're likely going to want to use ElevenLabs. You can also add in your own custom voice. So if you've paid for either an instant or a professional voice on ElevenLabs, you can just enter in your voice ID here from ElevenLabs, pop in an API key, then your voice agent can use your voice. You can also create a voice clone directly inside Retell, so you can drop in some audio files here, and then that will create an instant voice in ElevenLabs. So I'll play you an example in a moment of a voice agent I've actually built. If we go back out of here, I'll just touch on telephony while we're out here as well. So Retell do make it pretty easy to connect phone numbers to your agent, and you can buy them from within the platform. So phone numbers cost $2 a month. Now, slight downside here, if you're outside the US and Canada, you'll need to import your phone numbers either via Twilio or Telnix or ZipTrunk. But it's pretty straightforward. It takes literally a couple of minutes to get a phone number and verify it, and you can then connect it to one of your agents. This, by the way, works for both inbound and outbound agents. So you can either have people call that number or you can make calls from that number. So let's just jump into one of these agents and I'll show you a quick example of the voice realism. So let's go into this dental outbound agent. So one of my favorite things about Retell is testing. Some voice AI tools, you have to actually have it call your mobile device, which racks up costs and credits. And it's also just a bit clunky to keep doing that. Whereas Retell make it really easy. You can just click test agent and you can either chat with your agent, which is kind of handy if you're in a public place and you don't want to look insane having this conversation back and forth with your agent. Or you can test the audio and you literally just click test.
Hi, this is Grace from South Bay Dental Office. I'm reaching out regarding the form you submitted to learn more about our teeth cleaning package. Am I speaking with Marcus?
Yes.
I'm following up to see if you're still interested in our teeth cleaning package.
No, I'm all good, thank you. So as you can see, really simple. And it's nice that it visually kind of shows you which step of your workflow it's going down, so you can make sure that it's going through all those routes as you would expect. The voice quality, also pretty good. That was using CMO, which is just the default ElevenLabs options, but there's tons of different options that you can choose from here. So let's touch on one of the things that is less good about Retell. Integrations. So Retell, of course, if you are technical, you can connect this to absolutely anything using webhooks or using Model Context Protocol. But if you are non-technical, your options are a bit more limited. Retell don't have much in the way of native integrations. So if you want to connect it to something, you can add a function. And cow.com is basically the only native integration you will find on Retell.com. What I would say is that cow.com is kind of a bridge between various different calendar software. So if you want to connect Retell to Google Calendar or Outlook Calendar, for example, you can connect those into cow.com. So this is sort of like a Google Calendar integration, albeit indirectly. But that is it. Of anything other than a calendar integration, you're going to need to get your hands dirty, either by building a custom function where you trigger a HTTP request, or by connecting it into an MCP server, which is not massively difficult. And in some ways, this means the world is your oyster because virtually every tool now has its own MCP server. And all you need to do is enter the MCP server URL and then any headers or query parameters that you need to authenticate it. But I do point it out because it is a relative weakness of Retell. Most voice AI tools I use have a much broader range of native integrations, but Retell does not. So that brings me on to another point, which is concurrency. So this is an important concept when building voice agents because particularly if you're doing outbound calls or if you have busy periods and quiet periods, if you have 10 customers all calling you at once, you don't want to only have one phone line that means everyone's kind of on hold for ages. So by default, you can have up to 20 concurrent calls on Retell, which is pretty generous. And they've also got this handy feature called concurrency burst, where if you get a sudden influx of calls, instead of putting everyone on hold or forcing you to buy extra phone lines, you just pay a slightly higher rate. And this works for up to 3 times your normal limit. So essentially 60 concurrent calls. If you consistently have a higher number of concurrent calls, you're running a call center, for example, you can, of course, adjust your limit and it costs $8 per additional concurrent phone line, which again is pretty reasonable. So let's talk about latency. So the first thing I really like about Retell is they make this transparent. This is not true of all voice AI platforms. So when you're building your voice agent, you can see up here in the top bar the estimated latency for your agent. And this is quite handy because it gives you an indication if you suddenly add a really massive global prompt, that's going to push up the latency. You can also see things, for example, like changing the model, either using the fast tier or something like GPT 4.1 Nano. You should see an instant reduction in the latency. And generally, from my experience with Retell, it is slightly on the pessimistic side. So generally, I find that my actual latency is often slightly better than this. So coming on to that point, if you go into your call logs, you can see your actual latency. And another thing I really like about this is you can see the breakdown. So you don't just get this kind of one number. So here you can see 756 milliseconds, which is roughly what I see on average. So when I've done standardized latency testing across different tools, I believe with Retell, I was getting 714 milliseconds of end-to-end latency. That is not the best I've seen, but it is still very good. It's still in the realms of sounding natural and being very usable for a production voice agent. The thing I really like is that if you hover over here, you can get the breakdown of where that latency is happening. So you can see, is it at the speech to text stage? Is it the LLM or is it at the text to speech voice engine? And this is really helpful because it tells you where the problem is and therefore what you can do to improve and optimize it. This is quite rare to see in voice agent platforms. There's only 1 or 2 other platforms I can think of that actually give you this information. And for me, this just tells me like Retell is not trying to hide anything. They're giving you this information so you can do something with it and actually make your voice agent better. So in this case, for example, it's clear that we do not have a latency problem at the transcription stage, but we might want to tighten up our prompts or use a different model for the LLM inference. And possibly we might want to have a play around with the voice engine, but big wins are going to be at the LLM stage. So just really helpful. Now let's touch on costs. Now, generally speaking, when you add everything up, so like the LLM costs, telephony costs, etc., Retell comes out around about 13 cents per minute. Now, obviously, that is going to depend on the model you choose, the telephony options. There's dozens of things that affect this number, but generally for a standard tech stack, so GPT 4.1, DeepGram transcription, and 11 Labs Turbo V2, this is roughly going to be about right. It is not the absolute cheapest option for voice agents, but it's generally very reasonable. Anything under about 15 cents per minute is pretty decent. So for me, Retell is a really solid option. It gets a lot of the boring stuff like testing, latency, concurrency. It gets all these things right, but it also just makes it really easy to build production quality voice agents. So if you're non-technical, if you like building in no code and you don't want to be in the weeds building voice agents via an API, Retell for me is about as good as it gets. So next up, let's have a look at VoiceFlow. So VoiceFlow is a platform for building customer service AI agents. And there's 2 parts to this. There's the kind of the voice agent part and then also chat agents. And so in Voiceflow, you're building an agent that can be used either as a chatbot embedded on a website, or it can be run as a voice agent. I mention this because when you start building stuff in Voiceflow, it becomes quickly apparent that some features are more designed for the chat agents. So building voice agents is pretty straightforward, and a nice feature is you can just enter in a prompt and it's going to build out an agent workflow around that. So if we go into an agent I've previously built, you can see this nice canvas where you can build out your agents on. And building out these flows is pretty straightforward. You can just drag and drop to add agents. I personally don't love that you have to kind of double click into these to configure your agent. So you have to click on it once, then you have to click that, and then you pop your prompts in here and you can change things like the model. But credit where it's due, Voiceflow's got a decent amount of native integrations. You can see up here we've got things like make.com, HubSpot, Airtable, Google Sheets, Gmail, and then we can also connect this into MCP servers, webhooks, etc. In general, it's a pretty powerful platform that's pretty easy to use. In terms of testing your agents, similar to a lot of tools, you can simulate a call in the platform.
Connor, an AI agent that will demonstrate some key concepts in Voiceflow. In this step, I'll demo how you can use exit conditions to navigate the conversation based on the user's intention.
So I personally don't find the voice realism in Voiceflow quite as good as some of the alternatives. It sounds a little bit more robotic. One area where I have been surprisingly impressed by Voiceflow is latency. So when I ran the standardized latency test on Voiceflow, it was only slightly slower than Vapi, which is pretty incredible considering that Vapi is basically just the voice AI infrastructure. So Voiceflow beat both Retell AI and Simflow by quite a decent margin. I would like to see a little bit more in the way of metrics and stats that kind of highlight this. They don't make that quite as visible as some of the other platforms. But if you do run a test, you can see the real-time latency in the logs, as well as your credit usage, which I really like. It's really nice to be able to see this breakdown here while you're testing. Now, telephony options, if we go back into the dashboard, you can go to phone numbers and you can add phone numbers here from the dashboard. Unlike some of the other platforms, you don't get any free numbers with Voiceflow, so you will need to import your phone numbers from another platform. For me, this is not a deal breaker because I kind of have to do this anyway, regardless of what platform I'm using, because I generally need UK numbers. And the platforms that do give you free numbers, generally it's only a US or a Canadian one. Plus, they generally have restrictions on them around things like outbound calling. So not a deal breaker, but it's quite nice to get the free numbers just when you're testing. So it's one less thing that you have to do. So a few other things that are just worth being aware of. When it comes to concurrency, it's going to depend on what plan you're on. So by default, on the Pro plan, which is $60 a month, you get 5 concurrent phone lines. Then when you go up to the business plan, you get 15, and then enterprise, presumably it's whatever you negotiate. Now, while we're talking about pricing, Voiceflow is a fairly interesting one because as you can see here, we've got these kind of flat monthly pricing plans. But really what's going on here is you still have an amount of credits. So you can see we've got 10,000 credits, but there's no monthly rollover. The long and short of this is that if you actually use the amount of credits that you buy, then Voiceflow is very affordable. It comes out to around about 8 cents per minute, which is pretty much as low as you can possibly get at the moment for building a voice agent. However, the quirk around the monthly rollover means that, for example, if you only used half your credits one month, you're effectively paying double that amount, which means that's quite a lot more expensive than some of the alternatives. So it all comes down to whether you're actually going to use the amount of credits that you're buying. One little hack you could do is pay for an annual plan, and then you don't have to worry about the monthly rollover. You could also get a lower number of credits in the annual plan, so you kind of definitely use them up. But it's a little bit of a weird way of doing pricing. I wouldn't be surprised if they eventually change it, because most of the other voice agent platforms start with this kind of pricing and then eventually go to pay-as-you-go because of that reason. So both of these are great options for building voice agents on, and given that you can try both of them out for free, I'd recommend doing that to see which one's going to be a better fit for your use case. Now, I'll drop links to both of them below, as well as the side-by-side comparison that I put together. And if you'd like to watch me live build the same voice agent on both platforms, as well as 4 other voice AI tools, and then live test them with real phone calls, you can check that video out here.